Hey guys, Simon here with another video. And today I'm going to share with you 3 tips for how to crush nits in your games. Now, before I jump into it, it's probably worth discussing what actually is a nit, what defines a nit. And typically for me, a nit is anyone that typically plays for less than about 20% of hands. Now, you can have guys that are like, loose pre but nitty post flop, and guys that are nitty pre and like aggressive post flop. But typically what you're going to find is guys in your games that play less than 20, 21% of hands are going to be on the tighter side, and this pre-flop tight behaviour is actually going to lead into mistakes post flop where they're tight as well. Typically nits, they're people that like to trade a little bit of EV from their point of view for reduced variance. Now, this sacrifice that they make for less EV, we can capitalise on and counter-exploit them, but this is typically what defines a nit. Now, the first thing that I said is that a nit plays fewer hands pre-flop, and that we're using that VPIP feature on our HUD and our tracking software to identify these types of players. Now, the first thing that we can do is they under-defend their big blind. So we can, when you see a nit in the big blind, or even in the small blind, when we're in late position, like small blind, button, cutoff, we can open wider, and we're going to get a more profitable price to steal their big blind with a wider variety of hands. Now, what we can do is, if we have a look at something like a typical, so if we have a look here at a typical button opening range, what we could do if we see someone that fits the description of a nit in the big blind is we could open a touch wider. Now, we're not going to go crazy, we're not going to open 80% of hands or anything, because these guys are normally typically okay players post flop. But for starters, we're going to open up all the mixes pure, something like this. Then we can start to fill in a few extra hands as well. Maybe something like a couple of offsuit aces, maybe a couple of offsuit king x, maybe a couple of 7x, maybe something like this. And we're opening a range that's maybe 5-10% wider than we normally would be. We're not going crazy. We probably don't need stuff like this or even like this. But what we're doing is expanding our range, and we're adjusting to the fact that there's someone in the big blind that isn't defending their big blind often enough. Now, there is something that we do have to keep in mind that is kind of important when we start making an adjustment like this, and that's that when it comes to the flop, the ranges are going to be different than what they usually would in a button versus big blind scenario. The big blind is actually going to have a tighter, stronger range than they usually would, and our range is going to be weaker and a bit wider. Now, what we need to do then is we need to c-bet a little bit less frequently. We can't c-bet our range as much. We can't go nuts just range betting versus these people. What we typically need to do is we need to take more of a check back and delay strategy. And when we do bet, we're normally betting for a bigger, more polarized sizing. So this is the first thing we can do. Do you really exploit people that aren't defending their big blind often enough pre-flop? Now, the next mistake that I'm going to talk about is going to be a post-flop adjustment, and in particular, I'm going to talk about the river here. Now, quite often when you get to the river and you're facing someone that's a nit, and we've got something like a bluff that we're trying to work out whether we want to bluff. Typically, if we have a look at solver outputs for bluff candidates on the river, we're going to typically see that since bluffs are typically 0V kind of prospects, you're going to find that bluffs with good blockers like to bluff, and bluffs with bad blockers like to check back. Now, the typical characteristic of a nit means that someone that overfolds pre-flop and typically overfolds post-flop is going to typically make lots of folding mistakes. And by folding mistakes, they're going to overfold. Now, what that means is that our slightly losing bluff candidates that we're typically giving up versus a balanced, unexploitable opponent are now actually profitable candidates to bluff with. Things in this category might be a few double barrel of flush draw. Let's say a king high, queen high flush draw. And we get to the river and, the solver typically likes to check these candidates back because we block stuff that the solver, we want the solver to have to fold. But versus a nit, they're going to fold too many of their third pairs, their second pairs. They might even be folding stuff as strong as top pair versus us. And this is going to mean our bluffs are going to make more money and we can bluff more things versus them. And so we really need to be careful when we're playing versus nits is that we don't give up. We really apply the aggression because nits typically crumble to aggression. They've learned that most people don't bluff enough, and so they overfold everywhere. And this is the exploit that we're making to them. Now, there is another side of things when it comes down to the river. And this is what happens when we value bet. We talked about bluffing, we talked about, we want to bluff more hands than we usually would. But what happens when it comes to our value betting candidates? Now, typically when we make a value bet, what we're actually wanting is we want the opponent to call with a worse hand 50% of the time. That's the general heuristic that goes on here. Now, since Nits under defend and they overfold, what actually happens is we need to be tighter, and we need to like value bet like a stronger range and not give as many, not like value bet as thinly as we normally would, to make up for the fact that they're not going to call as much stuff versus. The fact that they're overfolding means we can go nuts with our bluffs, but it also means that we need to value bet like, you know, a little bit tighter versus them, because they're not going to be calling like, you know, ace highs versus in like, you know, these wide range spots where it goes check, check, bet, or like bet, check, bet, where typically the solver is going to find defends with stuff like ace high and like really like low pocket pairs. So we can't value bet like our third pairs and our fourth pairs in those kind of spots. And even in like tight range spots, sometimes hands as strong as like top pair, good kicker, isn't going to be good enough for a value bet versus Nit, because they're actually not going to call enough hands that worse. And even in like tight range spots, hands as strong as like top pair, top kicker, top pair, good kicker, might not even be good for a value bet versus Nit, because they're not going to call enough hands that are worse for the bet to be profitable. This is a pretty important adjustment to make, because typically versus Nit, what we're going to find is if we start to value bet too thinly, we're actually just going to value on ourselves, and they're only going to call, or they're going to call too often, just with hands that beat us and fold everything worse. Now, I think to like highlight these last 2 points around, you know, how we're bluffing, how we're value betting, it might be really interesting to have a look at a bit of an example. And so in this example, I've got the board of King 9 Deuce, and it's going to be button versus big blind. So we're going to start with a range bet, which is a typical strategy. Maybe we're not range betting this because it's like a Nit, but I think for the purpose of the example, I think it would be totally fine. We're going to get the 5 of diamonds turn, and we're mostly going to be overbetting, so we pick this. We can face a call, and then I want us to have like, you know, a pretty bricky river, so we might have something like, I guess 7 of clubs. Okay, and we have a look at the solver here, and we can see that there's a couple of different sizes. And what I'm going to do actually is I'm just going to create a subtree, and I'm only going to look at one size. I'm only going to look at the all-in sizing. Now, this is not normally how our strategy would play in game, but let's just, for the like purpose of this example, only have like, you know, the all-in sizing. Alright, so we now have a look, and this is what our strategy would look like if we were to play against a balanced opponent on the river, and we're only using an all-in sizing. Now, what we're going to see is we're going to see, if we have a look at the Range Explorer, that the worst hand that we're betting for value is probably going to be something like 2 pair or even making an overpair. And we can actually see here that aces is actually not even strong enough to bet for an all-in, so our worst value hand is going to be like, you know, 2 pair. We're going to bet 2 pair plus all our sets, all our straights, and these are going to be all-ins. And then what we're going to see with our bluffs is we're going to see that we're betting like, you know, some like Queen 8s, Jack 8s, and we're going to see there's some hands that are mixing, but we typically are giving up with things like, you know, Queen 10, particularly with diamonds, Queen Jack with diamonds, and so we can see that like, you know, our stronger Queen 8s we end up having to give up with, and we do prefer to have not diamonds. So we can see value betting 2 pair plus, all of our 2 pair plus, and we're basically bluffing, you know, our worst Queen Jack 10x, and we're preferring the hands without a diamond. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to adjust the range that's defending. And what we're going to do is we're going to assume that this player here is a Nit. So what we're going to do is we're going to set the strategy lock node, unlock all, and now we're going to select the range. And what we're going to actually change is we're going to assume that the Nit's still calling all these 2 pair plus, but we're going to get rid of all the second pair, third pair, low pair, and we're actually just going to make sure that he doesn't call anything that's ace high or, you know, not top pair. It's not a whole heap of hands, but we can see here that he's meant to call about 9% of the time with that stuff that isn't top pair. And this is like a really big size on the river. This is like a 2-3x jam. So I think this is a pretty reasonable assumption. And the other thing we could do is we could potentially have a look at like the top pairs, and we could mean that he doesn't call some of these top pairs, but I think we can leave these in as a bit of a mix. I think, you know, they are going to find some top pairs as a call. Alright, so we lock all that, save and close, and then tree, and then we just click go. So we're going to run this again, and the only adjustment we've made is they're not finding a couple of those bluff catch calls. You know, they're going to call a little bit tighter on the river, and not as wide as they should. Now what happens to our strategy here when we're the position player? And remember, we didn't make a huge adjustment. We can see all of a sudden, our nothing, these hands that we were like meant to be bluffing earlier, nothing, no draws, we can actually see these are all bluffing now. It doesn't matter the fact that we have like, you know, missed diamonds and the solver didn't like it, or the fact that our queen jack has a tiny bit of showdown in the old sim and we're checking back some of our best queen high. The fact that they're not calling enough on the river means that we're going nuts and we're bluffing really, really wide. And this is what I was talking about when I say that you've got to go nuts and really put the pressure on someone that isn't defending close to optimal frequencies. Now, on the other side of things, what happens with our value betting? Now, it was 2-pair plus here, and we can actually see that 2-pair is actually still value betting here. Sets, straights, still value betting. So our value betting range actually hasn't changed in this example, which is kind of curious. So it's actually curious that our value range is actually the exact same it was before. I think this is just one of those things where we haven't really changed their calling range too much. It's meant that our bluffs are really profitable, but I think that since the out of position player doesn't have a whole lot of hands that are actually stronger than 2-pair plus, it was still good to value bet it. If we have a look here, we can actually see that they actually really don't have a whole lot that's better than us. They have a couple of 2-pairs themselves, which are going to call, and most of these 2-pairs are actually worse. And then the rest of their stuff is basically just pure bluff catches. So it hasn't really affected our value range too much, but you can see how crazy we've had to go applying the pressure of value betting versus nits. I hope this has been really helpful for you guys today. If you found it useful, please like, please subscribe, leave a comment below if you have any feedback. Otherwise, I hope you guys have really enjoyed this today. If you have, please feel free to leave a comment and like and subscribe. If not, I'll see you next time. Cheers.